Good morning, everyone, and happy Sabbath. I'd like to welcome you all to the Branson Legacy Sabbath School class. We're in the middle of homecoming weekend, which is the first time that Loma Linda's put all of their schools' homecomings together. And this is one homecoming weekend. I understand that they're down at the Branson Center today. We're also in the middle of a series for the class. This is the third presentation out of 6 in our American Awakenings series. And trying to be poetic, I chose some 2-word alliterative titles for the series and all the little presentations. So we've done so far an Awakening of America, and then last time revivals and reforms. So we looked at the first Great Awakening, as it's referred to, and then began to look at this pre-Civil War period with Jonathan Butler. And we still have 3 presentations upcoming from that same time period before the Civil War and the same era that Millerism and Adventism was birthed. And next week, Dr. Graybill is going to be presenting, and he's going to come up and share a little bit about that now.
I think it's 2 weeks, isn't it? Isn't David Trim coming next week?
Oh, you're correct. You're correct. Yes.
On the 18th, I'm going to present on millennialists and utopians. And I have discovered and uncovered and will share with you the story of an Adventist woman, a good friend of Elder White, who was almost an unknown in Adventist history and yet had a profound influence on her life, who was both a utopian and a millennialist and an Adventist, and had spent time in poverty and then in wealth, and that's part of the story. So come on the 18th, and I won't use any slides. If Jonathan Butler's presentation was like Charles Finney, mine will be like Jonathan Edwards, because I have a script to read.
All right, so we've got a little tease there to bring you out in a couple of weeks. And next week, as Dr. Graybill said, we're going to have David Trim, who's the director of the Office of Archives and Statistics at the General Conference, and he's going to be presenting to the class. This week, we're taking a step back from this pre-Civil War, early 19th century period, and going to do the time in between the first and second Great Awakenings, and that's the time of the American Revolution and the foundation of the new government. And I asked Forrest Howe, who we all know well. Forrest has a background in pastoral ministry and stewardship throughout his career of service with the church, but he's developed an interest in this area and gave a presentation on the religious beliefs of America's founders a couple of years ago in the class. Also, we read a related book in the book club that I host. But I thought it'd be good to take another look at that in the context of coming before this awakening and between these two sort of evangelical awakenings, to look at some of the other faith and thought influences that were formative outside of just this evangelical context, and particularly how these would come together and help set the stage for the religious liberty that we prize so much in America and in other parts of the world. So Forrest is going to talk today about founders and freedoms. There are 3 handouts. If you missed them or haven't picked them up, they're over here that go with the talk today. Forrest?
I appreciate Dr. Butler sharing or changing with me last week. I had a very, very important engagement. Yep. Is that echoing?
A little bit. I might slide it down a wee bit, see if that helps, or I could adjust the gain. Not that far.
Yeah, that's right. How's that?
Let me try the game. Okay, talk now.
Am I talking okay?
Back up.
Thank you for all work you done.
Just look out, Joe.
Okay. Okay.
And just keep talking.
Talking, anyway, as I said, I had a very important appointment last week, and it was my granddaughter's 4th birthday. And we went to Mammoth. And we did get into Mammoth, but it looks like tunnels. I mean, it's tunnels all over the place. So if you didn't go to town, you wouldn't know where to find anything. But we had a great birthday party, and that's 4-year-old. She did very well. So anyway, and by the way, I don't ask the people in the back row, can you hear me or not? Because I did that one time, and several of the people in the back row indicated they couldn't hear me, and several in the front row got up and went back. All right, I'm going to be talking about that period right after the First Awakening, which was in the 1740s, part of the 1750s. And then last week we had the Second Awakening, but we need to know that even though there might have been a lull, the awakening didn't die out. And so we want to take a look at that. One of the most important issues for Adventists these days is that of religious liberty. And of course, A.T. Jones spoke before Congress in the 1890s. And today in America, the issue is whether or not America was founded as a Christian nation. And David was telling me he was trying to find a video on that. But it seems like every time you go to some video, somebody gets very polemical about the other side. I'm going to try not to be polemical, and I know we live in a post-modernistic society where you believe anything you want, and these issues of cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias seem to be prevailing. But I will be telling you the truth today, whether you accept it or not. It's up to you. But if you turn on TV or whatever, you will find one side that says, definitely America was founded as a Christian nation. And probably the most influential person on that is this David Barton. Has anyone heard anything from David Barton? Okay, David Barton wrote a book, Jefferson's Lies. He's been an advisor to several campaigns. He's on the Texas Board of Education, coming out with a new, it probably already come out now, a new textbook on the American founding generation. Unfortunately, his book was withdrawn from the shelves citing factual errors. And this is very unusual to have, I think it was Thomas Nelson that had his book out, and it was even on the New York Times book of, what is that, 10 best books. So anyway, David Barton, not named after Barton Road here, I don't think, but anyway, but he's very influential. You don't hear too much about him anymore because of some of his revisionism. And it's not just progressives that have had struggle with him, it's also those on the religious right as well. And they say his history just not square with what we know. And that's why his book was taken out of circulation. Now just kind of hold up, oh, and then of course the other side of it is that we weren't founded as a secular, we were founded as a secular nation, and the Americans for United Separation of Church and State support that, the ACLU and others. And I'm going to come back to that, but I want to go back now and look at some of the other issues, and some of these dealing with us as Adventists other than religious freedom. One of the big issues that came out of the Great Awakening in the 1740s, or I shouldn't say it came out, but it was kindled again, and that was anti-Catholicism. You remember in the 17th century, now those of you who are more of a British background know your history better than I do, but the 17th century was a conflict between Catholicism in Great Britain and Protestantism. And Charles I was trying to bring back Catholicism to Great Britain, and he lost his head over it, literally lost his head over it. And then when the monarchy was restored, there was another attempt, and then, help me now, it was Charles II, and then James II came after that. And then there was this glorious revolution. And the British brought a new monarch to the throne, who was definitely Protestant, William of Orange. And so this battle between Catholicism and Protestantism had been very strong in England in the 17th century. It was also had its influence in North America, especially the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was primarily Puritan. They lost their charter around 1775, 1780, and then it was restored at the Glorious Revolution. And so then we come up to this period of the Great Awakening, and this conflict was very, very strong. The issue of, will that Pope of Rome take over again? And they were very, very concerned. And then if you look at your timeline, in 1754 to 1763, we have the 7 Years' War. Now I know you can look at that and say, well, that's 9 years, but don't ask me why it's called 7 Years' War, and it took 9 years. We in America, North America, call this the French and Indian War. Now, this war was much broader than just us. This truly, as Winston Churchill said, was a world war. It was fought in Europe. It was fought in the Far East, the Philippines, Indonesia, South America, the Caribbean. And so this war was very, very extensive, and not only extensive, but very expensive. It cost the British government 150 million British pounds to conduct this war. And after the war, half of their national budget was to pay for the 7 Years' War. So it was very expensive. And so who were we fighting? France. And who did France represent? They represented the Pope. They were Catholics. They had those Quebecois up there north of New England. And they knew at any time those French would come down and take over. Well, that was the rumors. And so the war lasted, I think in North America until around 1761, and the French were defeated. Their allies were defeated as well. Most of the Indian tribes did side with the French except for the Iroquois. Something happened when Champlain came to North America with the tribe, and they never liked him after that. And so the 5 nations of the Iroquois Confederation sided with the British. By the way, sometimes we get the idea these North American Indians, the First Nations, were just kind of wandering around the woods. but they owned land. They knew what their land was. And the Iroquois Confederation had been around, many people feel, for about 500 years. And that went through central New York. And anybody from New York knows we have the Senecas and the Mohawks and the Cayugas and the Oneidas and the Onondagas. And people say, where'd they get those names? And I said they got them from the cities that they were near. But this war had a religious overtone to it. The book of Revelation is being fulfilled. The Pope is the beast. And so it was important that the British represent or defeat the French. And they did. What's interesting, though, there were probably very few French-speaking settlers, probably around 10,000 at the most at the time, whereas in the British colonies there were close to 2 million. So it was a matter of time, but it was a very violent war, torture. They didn't take prisoners, neither side. And so, after this conflict, which was seen as a religious war, and also part of the religious war was this, as Ron was saying, talking about the millenarianism, is that was part of it too. The millennium was going to be here soon. This is the book of Revelation being fulfilled. So the war is over. 1765. The Stamp Act. Well, the British felt they had a right to tax the British colonists because, why? They had spent all this money and kept the British colonists secure. But the British colonists didn't like it. They had all sorts of ruckus. But the biggest, by the way, the Stamp Act didn't last that long. The British Parliament rescinded it, but they put the proviso in there, and this is what really galled the colonists. We can restart this anytime we want. And of course, the colonists didn't like that, and so they compared that with popery. And so this theme keeps going. Just a little side issue here, in 1770s, the Virginia Baptists were persecuted. And they kind of come out of the First Awakening. And James Madison defended many of these Baptist ministers who had been thrown in jail without heat. Virginia can get kind of cold in the winter in certain parts. Well, I guess anywhere really in Virginia, but James Madison young Madison defended many of these Baptist preachers. We'll see where that fits into later. 1774. What happened? Well, the British, again, they had conquered Quebec, Canada. But you know, if you know your geography, there's really no major boundary between the British colonies and Quebec. And so the British, because they were having a hard time keeping the Quebecois under control, they gave them religious liberty and kind of gave them a quasi-self-government. And of course, what did that say? Catholics, they're at our door. And then there were the Intolerable Acts, and I don't remember all of them, but they had something to do with closing the port of Boston. Someone has said, though, the main reason that the Americans didn't like the Intolerable Acts was that the Americans liked to smuggle, and the British kind of wanted to put an end to that. So And then 1775, we know about Lexington Green and Concord Bridge. And then in 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. But actually, hostilities have been going on for close to a year, or over a year by that time. Originally, in 1774, the Continental Congress had got together and had tried to work something out with the British Parliament, but were unable to. They weren't ready to declare independence, but it was just a matter of time. And then, as I said, in 1775, the Lexington Green and the Concord Bridge issues. By the way, I lived in Massachusetts for 12 years and go by the monument all the time of the Minutemen. And my boys, when they were young, they got really smart. They said, "Dad, that's not the Minutemen." I said, "Well, what is it?" "It's the Minute Men." They got between the rocks and they shot the British in the feet as they went back to Boston. So that's part of the war I didn't know about, but my boys say it's true. So anyway, in 1776 to 1781, the Revolutionary War, we weren't doing well. The good guys weren't doing well. So what did we do? We hired who?
Lafayette.
What?
Lafayette.
No, we. Je suis ici, monsieur. And what were the French? Catholics. Oh, by the way, one of the side issues that I was intrigued about were the number of loyalists that remained remained firm with the British Crown. Matter of fact, our friend Graham Stacy, his wife is a descendant of a Revolutionary War soldier, but a Tory. And so Graham and I were talking about, because I'm a descendant of a Revolutionary War soldier on the good side. And so I guess the reason I'm the good guys and they're the bad guys is we wrote the history. We won, you know, and so the winners usually write the history. So after the Revolutionary War, a lot of the Tories went to Canada. Now, they had to. And I remember here a few years ago, well, several years ago, when we were in York, Pennsylvania, we took a group of students up to Toronto, where in 1812, the American armies attacked what is now Toronto, it was called York then. And we had a guide. He said, he came up to me and said, "You know, we tell the story from the British side. And all your kids are Americans." And I said, "Tell it to them. They need to hear both sides of it." So they got to tell about how the American armies left and went up into what is now Ontario to free all these Canadians. And the Canadians were going to greet them with flowers and put flowers in the barrels of their butt. Oh yeah, that's another war. Anyway, Americans didn't do well. But these were actually the descendants of the Tories that remained loyal to the British Crown. And they really had many, many regiments. And I have heard at one time there were more colonials fighting for the British in 1778 than were fighting for the American army. So anyway, we can do that with another day. By the way, you see, in 1780, I've got the dark day. As Adventists, we know the dark day, don't we? This was a big deal. This was a sign that the end was near. Prepare for the coming of the Lord. We're in the middle of this war against the evil. What more can we have? A sign. A sign. And so the dark day was very critical. They saw this. He saw these in very much religious overtones. And if we don't just bear right down, the devil will win. Well, in 1781, the siege of Yorktown basically ended the hostilities. Remember, the British armies were trapped at Yorktown. 20,000 soldiers surrounded Yorktown. 14,000 of them were French. 7,000 or 6,000 were American. The French fleet defeated the British fleet off the coast. And so really, if it hadn't been for the French, we probably would be driving on the left-hand side of the road today and putting U's in a lot of our words. I battled my former secretary one time. She was from England, and she always wanted to spell Savior with a U. And I told her that's not how we do it. And it usually was the last one to get a hold of the document. That's how it came out. So, by the way, Noah Webster was very adamant about that we have our own American spelling. And so, anyway, no U's in color, Savior, or a bunch of other words I can't think. So, 1783. I'm kind of skipping through several of these. I want to get. Okay, 1780. Oh, by the way, in 1781, 1783, the Articles of Confederation were formed, which was the first constitution for the United Colonies. It didn't work. And so in 1797, I'm getting ahead of myself. 1786, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom was voted on, and the main author of that was none other than Thomas Jefferson. But Jefferson was in France at the time, and so his colleague James Madison, what do you call it when they usher it through a house, through a legislative? Anyway, it was Madison that did that, and it was voted. And on Jefferson's tombstone, the inscription, as he stipulated, reads, "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." Doesn't mention being a president at all. But for Jefferson, the Declaration, the Statute of Religious Freedom in Virginia was one of the most important events in his career. By the way, another little side issue is Jefferson and Madison communicated an awful lot, but they were afraid that they would be opened, their mail would be opened. And so they developed their own code. And people today still are trying to break that code. They understand most of it, but there's still places. They were afraid that somebody was going to open up their mail. I mean, a postmaster would open up their mail and read it and share it with somebody they didn't want them sharing it to. Okay. So the two things that I wanted to comment on which have an impact on Adventism through this time is, one was the anti-Catholicism that came out of the Great Awakening, the French and Indian Wars, the Revolutionary War, except for that little period when we did hire the French to come help us. Kind of looked the other way for that. Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. How many people have been to Philadelphia in the summertime? Is it hot? It was, and they kept the windows closed because they didn't want people from the outside listening to their conversation. So I'm sure that it was not, they were not comfortable all the time. And they slugged it out through the summer, and they came up with the Constitution without the Bill of Rights. Many of those who had been there for most of the summer left without even signing it. They didn't agree with it, so they left. And many who had signed it didn't understand all the ramifications. This was a new concept. And so through 1787, 1788, there were the constitutional conventions. And this was a close-run thing. They almost didn't get it through in places. They had to get 3/4 of the states to approve it, and they did. And one of the main way they were able to get it through was Madison promised that they would put a Bill of Rights. And in 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified. Actually, I understand that there were 12 or 13 originally, but only 10 remain. So, okay. Was the Constitution of the United States built on Christian principles? Now, our friend who we mentioned here, David Barton, says that there are many passages in the U.S. Constitution that are taken directly from the Bible. And so many have looked to that, and you know what? I can't find it. God is only mentioned obliquely in the Constitution. It starts out, has no connection to God at all. And matter of fact, that was one of the big issues during the Constitutional Conventions, especially a well-known name that we know of, Patrick Henry, who wanted to put Jesus Christ's name into the Constitution, and they voted it down. And I was trying to find another quote from one of the delegates from Maryland, who said that there were several at the Constitutional Convention who wanted to put Christianity in this, but it was turned down. Alexander Hamilton was asked, how come God is not mentioned in the Constitution? He had a couple flip answers. We forgot. Or he wasn't around. But that was a major issue for many at the Constitutional Conventions about a godless constitution. Now there are things like, someone said the non-denominational moniker like great author or almighty being. It is interesting to note that the father of our country spoke no words of a religious nature on his deathbed even. So, this idea that the Constitution established a Christian nation seems to be without much support. And of course, that's what many on the religious right are saying, that these men, it was all men, that they were Christians, and the Constitution has the words of God in it. And so therefore, as a Christian nation, we need to support Christian policies and Christian laws. Just a couple of other things. In the 1790s, we had the French Revolution. The Treaty of Tripoli, I think I have that on as one of my quotes. In 1797, Article 11, the Treaty of Tripoli, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religions, or tranquility of Muslim, Islam. And as the said states never have entered into any war or act hostility against any Mohammedan nation, it is declared that the parties, that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. This was passed unanimously by the U.S. Senate. There was no reaction against it in any of the papers. John Adams signed it. And so, again, I think the burden is on those who want to say that the United States is a Christian nation. Just want to hurry on to 1800 was the election of Thomas Jefferson. He and John Adams, they had a little different way of doing the votes then. But Jefferson was considered a deist and not someone that should be trusted. Timothy Dwight, the president of Yale University, spoke out against him. But on the opposite side of this were John Leland and the Danbury Baptists. Now you remember back in the early 1770s, who was in trouble? It was the Baptists, right? And who defended them? James Madison. And they got, in 1786, they got religious freedom in Virginia. So the Danbury Baptists, even though they totally disagreed with Thomas Jefferson's theology, they greatly appreciated his emphasis on no establishment of religion. And that was the issue that was not carried forward from the First Awakening. You could preach, but you can't preach in my church, or you might get thrown in jail, or you might be fined. So there was no freedom to proclaim as you believed. And so when John Leland and the other Baptists saw that Thomas Jefferson was for election, they supported him. Matter of fact, after Jefferson won, they sent him this huge wheel of cheese that was brought to Washington on a cart of oxen. And John Leland actually preached at the church there in Washington after the inauguration. And of course, Thomas Jefferson talks about the wall of separation. And of course, I think there's been more heat than light on that. What did Jefferson mean? I personally think he had to deal more with establishment of religion. Because there were still states that had established churches. And Jefferson kindly referred to the clergy in Massachusetts as the Black Regiment. That was actually one of his nicer terms. And of course, the wall of separation, and I'm not going to get into that today for what that means to them, letting the courts handle it, but I'm talking about just at the period of the Founding Fathers. I want to take a look at some of the myths of the founding generation, and that is these men were not evangelical Christians. Most of them, well, all of the ones, Madison, Paine, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, were not Christians in an evangelical sense. Adams, who was probably most conservative theologically, was a Unitarian. And most congregational churches in Massachusetts at the time had become Unitarian. They had moved away from their Calvinism. Matter of fact, Adams said he did not believe in the Trinity, that even if God himself told him that there was a Trinity, he wouldn't believe it. So, there were a level below, I'd say below, the secondary lights, who probably were more evangelical Christian. Patrick Henry. At the end of his life, at the very end of his life, in 1804, Alexander Hamilton became a Christian. That was after he was wounded, mortally wounded in a duel, and held on for several days. So, anyway. So my conclusion, based upon my search of this topic, and I've been looking at this for several years because I've been interested, and I do have an interest in American history. As I told you, I have family that were Revolutionary War soldiers, and I just recently found out I'm a descendant of a Mayflower passenger. I thought we were, I could just never break through that. And my second cousin came up and showed that. So I do have a history of that, and of course the name like Howe, if you know anything about American history, we were on both sides. I didn't know that until recently, but of the two Howe brothers, that one was the Viscount, the Admiral, and the other was the General, they had a third brother, an older brother, who was actually killed in 1758 at the Battle of the Snowshoes. He was the British general fighting for the American cause, so they had a sympathy towards America. Anyway, I find this more than just casually interesting, but I'm convinced that the founding generation that wrote these documents did not establish America as a Christian nation. Now, that's not saying that there weren't Christians in America. And I think later on, after the Second Awakening, get towards the Civil War, we find things are different. So, I've hurried through a lot of that. I'll take questions now. Yes, young lady.
What were the three Bill of Rights that didn't make any?
I forgot what they were. I think one of them was that the representatives, when they came to Congress, had to take a poll of their district and find out how their district felt about on an issue. Madison felt that when you came to the Congress, you represented America as a whole, not just your district. And so, yeah, you have to pay attention to your district or you're not going to get reelected. At the same time, you have to look out for the broader good of the country. And I did, as I said, I don't remember what the other two were.
Forrest, you started your timeline with the 18th century here. I will go a little bit backwards in the 17th century. Because the colonies that came here, the first colonies, they were coming from Europe, and most of them came because of the religious persecution that was there. And I will start the timeline with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that ended the 30 Years' War between Protestant princes and the Catholic princes. And that was the first step in the right direction, I would say. It was not complete talking about the freedom of religion, but a principle was adopted there at the Peace of Westphalia that was enunciated in this way: cuius regio eius religio. That means the religion of the prince is the religion of the subjects too. Then, now, starting from that moment on, we have two religions in Western Europe. Until that time was just the Catholic religion. Now, officially, we have two religions, Protestant religion and the Catholic religion. And then you mentioned the Stuarts in England, Charles I and Charles II. Well, I think it's very important to mention in between them Oliver Cromwell.
Yeah.
That was a strong Protestant, was opposing, of course, he was the one that convinced the parliament to decapitate Charles I, and then with the restoration of Charles the second in 1659. Now, talking about the separation between the state and the religion. Of course, most of those that are studying this problem, they are basing the arguments pro or contra on the letter of Thomas Jefferson that was addressed, as you mentioned, to the Baptists in London. I think there are two, and also we are looking today at the First Amendment, how it was formulated. Because between these two, I sided on those that are saying that America was founded on Christian principles. Because how can you deny that? I mean, these people were coming from Europe because they were religiously persecuted. And every colony had its state church. That was not, of course, the right thing, because still was imposing on all of them just one belief. But still, these people, the morality was a Christian morality that was the foundation of this nation. You cannot deny that. We have today in God we trust on the money.
Well, let me just answer that. That came much later.
Yes, later, that's right.
Much later.
Yes. But these people that came from Europe, they have strong religious beliefs. Of course, they are not Baptists or Pentecostals or whatever they came later. But they have strong religious beliefs. And in the First Amendment, I think that there are a key word there, which basically the discussion is most about. It's endorsing, establishment, and endorsing. These are two different things.
Free exercise.
Establishing means that the state is establishing a church and imposing on the other people, all people, to have one belief. Endorsing, it's something else. It's supporting. And Thomas Jefferson that sent that letter to the Baptists, after he sent the letter, 2 days later, he went and attended the church. The House has its church, the Senate has its church, and they were attending church services. Then we cannot say that it's not religious rooted the foundation of this nation.
Well, it depends on what you mean by a nation. The very reason that the nation, the government, the Constitution is as secular as it is because we had Roger Williams in Rhode Island who believed one thing, and we have, the Puritans in Massachusetts believed another, and then we had the Catholics in Maryland, and then we had Jamestown was founded for completely secular.
Jamestown was formed for commercial reasons.
So these people with and now by the time we're forming a nation, our leaders are mostly all deists, and so they say, listen, if we're going to get all these religious people together in one nation, we have to have a secular nation, not a religious nation. There were religious reasons why many of these people came, but there were different religious reasons, which is the reason why we have to have freedom of religion and toleration of all of these religions, and the nation itself is not a religious entity.
Well, I believe that mostly what the problem is here that they wanted to avoid what happened in Europe, that just establishing one church was creating problems, serious problems there for the others being persecuted that didn't believe. And this is what they try to avoid. But still, I believe that the morality was a Christian morality that was at the base of this nation.
But
of course, the founding fathers were avid readers by candlelight of all things. Read the Bible, but if you read what the founding fathers had to say about the morality that exists in the Bible, they got it from Voltaire. Voltaire believed in governmental morality, and the founding fathers were very well aware of what Dr. Graybill was saying here. There were so many Christian beliefs. Whose Christianity are you going to put into the Bible? They steered clear of the Christian motif. Well, some might argue that there's no morality without Jesus Christ. And of course, Voltaire was a good Catholic until he pointed out the hypocrisy of the chief elders of his day, and he was castigated as a heretic. But I think basically, from my understanding, the Constitution is based on governmental morality, primarily from Voltaire.
And I'll get to you just a minute. It's my understanding that religion was important to the founding generation. They felt it was important to keep the people together. That did not mean they believed it. I think they were kind of hypocritical with it to a degree. And if you read later de Tocqueville, who writes after the French Revolution, he feels that religion keeps people in their place. So it was a pragmatic reason that they felt that religion was important. But they personally did not believe it. Franklin, Washington, this idea that Washington knelt at Valley Forge belongs to some of these other myths. The Parson Weems, the cherry tree, throwing the money across the Delaware, was it Delaware, Rappahannock? Somebody, they tell me that people have tried that, they can't do it, which only goes to show you that money doesn't go as far these days as it used to. So anyway, I'm going to say, I just think they used religion as a tool to keep the people in check.
Do you find it necessary to deny the founding fathers' form of Christianity as we continuously try to elevate Christ as God? Because his main thing in 1820 in his Bible, or The Life and More of Jesus Christ, his main difference in the Christianity that we present now is that he did not believe that Jesus was God.
No. I don't think any of the founding fathers did.
So it's a new thing that we're dragging along, and so we have to separate. I think sometimes we think we need to separate. Somebody, that was his form of Christianity, and today we have our own.
Well, I think that's a very good point. Michael?
In the context of the series and framing it, it seems like you can look at this as a sequence of like alteration.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have this great revival in America, and then you have this founding period, which seems dominated largely by rationalist, Enlightenment, theistic rationalist figures. And then you have this Second Great Awakening with revivalism and reform movements and all of that. But I'm wondering how much you see it that way as kind of trends that alternate, or as parallel tracks or different influences that were both powerful in America, one being a strong religious and evangelical influence, and one being Enlightenment, rationalist influence.
Yes. Now, the thing that I will agree with Peter on, that we have in our DNA Christianity, conservative Christianity, and that kind of permeates. It just seems like it comes up every once in a while, especially at conflict. So, and that's probably why it is. But we do see these two trends going on in America even today.
I'd like to try an idea out and see how you respond. It seems to me that when we get into the discussion, we always sort of get bogged down. And I wonder if something along what Michael has in mind works. And I'm going to suggest that there are three continuing impulses in American life. One is the theocratic impulse that we saw first in New Mexico and then in New England. And then secondly, there is the deistic impulse of the founders that you suggest. But then there's a third, religious liberty, that we get from Roger Williams. And I think initially in geographical ways one might be able to plot those out, but that actually the nation as a whole is an ongoing struggle amongst these three impulses. And indeed, in any American citizen, there might be these three impulses. One, sort of theocratic impulse, another, ceremonial deist impulse, and thirdly, one that's deeply committed to religious liberty. So that in this way, we can account, I hope, for the culture as a whole, but also some of the inner psyche that we have.
Yeah, Donna had it.
I took a class in the religious roots of the Constitution in law school.
Yeah.
And I think, and one of the ways in which the person who was running that class, one of the sections was not on the Christian reflection of Christianity in the Constitution, but the reflection of Old Testament Judaism and the Ten Commandments and some of the ceremonial laws that, in fact, is in the Constitution. And we see it, Christianity filtered, or the Old Testament filtered. So I sort of agree with Peter. There are principles, biblical principles, not necessarily Christian or New Testament, but the influence of the Old Testament and Hebraic law is definitely reflected in the Constitution and in civil law, period. You know, you can have one wife, you can't take somebody else's, you can't, property law is very old, and that also comes out of the Old Testament and is reflected again, and the government can't, and so forth. So I think that if we can kind of separate in our minds the kinds of religious influence that are in the Constitution as opposed to specifically Christian. Anyway.
With all the reform movements that happened, I think there are also multiple influences there, you know, some that are very Christian-centric, and some that are more Enlightenment rationalist influenced, and some that are more of a romantic sort of influence too. So I think all those factors in different ways led to some of the great reform movements of the era.
Oh, okay. David?
What do you think of Robert Bella's idea of American civil religion? It was published in 1967, I read.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm familiar with Bella's, but civil religion?
American civil religion was an idea.
I think that's really
published.
what some of this founding generation were pushing. You know, they had encouraged church, they encouraged chaplaincies, they encouraged a lot of these things. So I think, I would tend to believe that's kind of what the founding generation was pushing. But I'm not sure of Bella specifically.
Well, he, I think, was thinking more about the fact that we make our history a religious exercise almost, memorializing great events in American history and great ideas in American life.
Well, I'm going to have to pass on that one, but
Okay.
that's not my topic, but I do think there's some merit in that, David. Yeah.
So actually, Donna's comment triggered a memory. About a decade ago, there was a new translation of the first 5 books of the Bible by a gentleman named Robert Alter. And I don't know if people have seen it. He was attempting to get the sort of poetic aspects of the translation back in. And I liked the translation so much, I went online and looked up everything he'd written. And one of these books was titled Pen of Iron, which is sort of about the impact of the King James Version on American literature and history. And I gave up on the book because the vocabulary in it was such that I had to have a dictionary in one hand and the book in the other. But I did make it through the introduction, and this is the part that ties into what Donna had mentioned. He pointed out in there, and I think he's correct, that America, particularly from the founding of the colonies up through the Civil War, viewed itself much more in line with the Old Testament concept of exodus, freedom, deliverance from enslavement, than it identified itself with a lot of New Testament themes. And as examples, he showed that a lot of the Ivy League universities actually have Hebrew mission statements and the like rather than Latin. But it kind of tied into what Donna said. There may be a lot more in the founding documents resting on Old Testament allusion than are resting on New Testament allusion, whether the people were believers or not, just because they resonated with this theme of deliverance, freedom, and exodus.
Let me just finish it. The unfinished agenda is voting rights. Even after the Revolutionary War and even after the Constitution, only about 15% of the population could vote. Sorry women, sorry blacks, sorry non-landowners, sorry First Nations. You had to be white, you had to be semi-wealthy, then you could vote. The issue of slavery haunted, of course, broke us all up in the 1860s. Where Great Britain, by the way, gave up slavery, what, around 1808 or something like that. I think it's very, very early. Yeah, but it was much earlier than ours. Women's rights, the British were further ahead of that, and then the treatment of First Nations. We did not do a good job. We ripped the Indians off. We gave them smallpox, but they did get back to us. They gave us syphilis and casinos. All right, I'll be up here. Can we just read our, or do you want to read this, Mike? Okay. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. By the way, I have some books up here. I actually am a stronger supporter of James Madison than I am Thomas Jefferson. And this book I still think is the best. He talks about theistic rationalism. So anyway, thank you.